Yes, daktari.
All right. So we are looking at information processing model theory. Now, when we talk about information processing model, I want you to paint a picture of how facts, you know, some factual information, facts, concepts, principles, and skills are attended to in your head. How they enter the memory banks of your head, and how they are retrieved, and how they may be forgotten. And I want you, as we go through this, to look at the Atkinson and Schrieflin model of 1968. This model considers human beings as in information processing system that senses, that stores, and that retrieves information much as a computer does. Okay? The systems discussed under this model, you can call them hypothetical. These systems are the memory systems that explain how learning occurs. How learning occurs. Okay? So, draw 3 boxes, and in box number 1, and as we go through this accent, you can go through what I'm talking about by googling the Atkinson and Schrieflin 1968 model. This model is provided on your e-learning portal. You can go through it and see it. For now, listen, understand, and when you go to the portal, the class portal, under the activity, you'll find this model there. Now, draw 3 boxes, very simple ones. 3 boxes, they should be long enough. So in box number 1, call it sensory memory. You can call it the sensory memory. Connect the short term, the sensory memory to the next box, and the next box, you call it the short term memory. Okay? You call it the short term memory. Then from there, you draw another arrow from the second box that the long term memory. The long term memory. Okay? Now, when you get to the long term memory, you stop there. So you have a box reading sensory memory, the second one reading short term memory, the third one reading long term memory. Okay? All right. Now, the sensory memory is also known as the sensory register. That is your box 1. So that memory right there, you can also call it a sensory register. So it's a sensory memory or a sensory register. The short-term memory is also another term that is used interchangeably with short-term memory, which is the working memory. Okay. Long-term memory is also known as the permanent memory. All right. Now I want us to look at the sensory register. Let's look at the sensory register. First of all, an individual processes the inputs, that is the signals from the environment, taken in through the sensory registers, that is the ears, the eyes, and the skin. So now you're looking at your box number 1. The sensory register holds visual data, okay? And this visual data is called the iconic memory. Iconic memory. And this iconic memory takes 0.5 to 1 second to perceive this data. It takes 0.5 of a second or a full second to perceive this data. So 1 second, how long is 1 second? Anybody? It's very short, very brief. So what about half a second? So that is the duration that the sensory memory will take to hold visual data. Half a second up to a second. All right? Now, having said that, the sensory register briefly holds mental representations of auditory stimuli, which is also called the echoic memory, and it takes about 4 seconds to perceive the information received. Attending or paying attention is very important at this point. If an individual does not pay attention to some information, the information will be lost. Have you heard? If you don't pay attention to some information, this information will be lost. All the information that is not attended is also forgotten. Okay. Having said that about the sensory memory, which we also have agreed, we will call it the sensory register. Then we go to our second box. Our second box, we've said, it's dealing with short-term memory, which we are also calling the working memory. Okay? In some books, you'll also find it referred to as a thinking pad. You know? Now, what does it do? The information that is attended to is then transmitted to the short-term memory. Now we are bringing what happens in the first box to the second box, which is the temporary storage facility, which can hold limited amounts of information. The major functions of a short-term memory is to hold information long enough for processing. This is a matter of seconds. You use short-term memory when you add figures in your hand, when you remember a telephone number, okay? When you listen to a lecture like this one, or when you take part in a conversation. The information is held in your memory long enough for you to dial the telephone number, long enough for you to take lecture notes, long enough for you to answer a question, long enough for you to respond to a comment, etc. The information then leaves the short-term memory. After it leaves the short-term memory, it is either discarded, it's rendered useless, not important, or it's forgotten because it is of no further value, or it is moved to the long-term memory for future use. Short-term memory has limited capacity. It can contain approximately 5 to 9 pieces of information at a time. In general, short-term memory can be compared to a simple calculator. Entries are made and then quickly cleared to make room for new information. Are we together? In short-term memory, the image tends to fade away significantly after 10 to 12 seconds. If it is not repeated or rehearsed, it will fade away automatically. Rehearsal involves the reciting of information, revisiting of the information, rethinking, and going through of the information over and over. For example, repeating a phone number of a person's name. Okay? So if you meet someone new and you want to get their name, you'll keep asking, oh, by the way, you told me your name is, Jane. Okay, Jane. Then after some time, you again say, your name was Jane, Janet, Jane. Then the person tells you Jane. Then you are correcting the information, you are going through it over and over, and now it will be saved appropriately in your hand. Same as when I give you my number and you do not note it down in a notebook, you note it on your notebook in your hand, which is your thinking part. All right? Okay. Then we go to the long-term memory. We go to the long-term memory. Joy, mute your microphone. We go to the long-term memory. Through rehearsing, an individual can place information in the long-term memory. The long-term memory is a virtually permanent storage. A virtually permanent storage facility containing names, dates. A good example can be birthdays, can be places, such as cities. Kisumu City, Mombasa City, Nairobi City. Which other city? You can add them there. Any other cities we have in Kenya? Okay. The long-term memory bank has unlimited capacity. Unlimited. It can never be packed. It can never be filled up. It can never be out of space. It's unlimited capacity. The fact that the information is in the long-term memory does not mean, and note this one, does not mean you can find it whenever you like, because we said it's permanent memory as well. So not always you'll find the information in your long-time memory when you want it. If it is not well organized, Like say you met someone, you ask their name and they said, I'm Chibalonza. So, and you say Chibalonza. Okay, I've got it. Then you go home because it's, or even the next day, you try to remember the name of this person. You pronounced it well. The person said, yeah, that's how we pronounce it. You try and go Chiba, Chiba what? Chiba. You try to recall that name and it disappears. That one is expected. And that's why I'm saying it does not mean you can find the information in your long-term memory whenever you like. Yeah, especially if it was not well organized. So remember your told ones, Chibalonza. You did not repeat it. You did not rehearse the name. So just one pronunciation, you got it and things went on. You thought it was saved properly. Now, chances are it was actually not stored appropriately. If information in the long-term memory is not well organized, if the files in your long-term memory are not well organized, it will be difficult to retrieve that piece of information. So like now, we are in the middle of the information processing model. Someone calls me, I'm in class, and we start talking about a construction site that we are doing and all that. When we start talking about the construction site and how work is going, you in this particular class will have mixed information that you have overheard. Where we are discussing information processing model, you will also hear construction information. You hear the site, you hear ballast, you hear stones, you hear biodigester, you will hear many other things that are relevant to the information processing model. So now when you go back home, you might remember what I talked about when I received a call about the construction site more than you remember the information processing model. And that might affect how well the information you have in your file is organized, how well it is retrieved, and how well it is filed or stored. Like now, you are in this class attending from home. Maybe someone comes in, a guest knocks the door, you have to go and open, you have to serve tea, you have to do this. A lot of information that we are discussing here that was supposed to go to your long-term memory may end up not getting to the long-term memory. And if you store this information, even when you start going through this content now, rehearsing it, you will go rehearsing it and you remember the construction site, you remember the guest who came and knocked the door, because this information, wrong information is put in the wrong place. And that is where we talk about errors in filing, errors in cataloging, all happening in your brain. Those can affect how information is retrieved in your long-term memory. Now, having talked about the information processing model by Atkinson and Schifrin, and I'm categorically focusing on their 1968 model. You can Google it. How do we apply this information processing theory to a learning situation? How can we apply that? This is how we can get about it. We have about 10 minutes to end our class. One, get information attended to. Okay? Get information attended to. This is what we can pick from this information processing theory or model. Get information attended to. The teacher should try to encourage learners to pay attention. Eh? Don't allow them to play with their ball pens or with spinners, you know, these things, round things that they get from biscuits. They come to class and start playing with that takes your concentration away from class. So don't let them to play with spinners, to play with clay, plasticine, or even with their parents, or even with their friends. When you are teaching, the teacher should try to encourage learners to pay attention. And you know why? The storage of the information. What goes to the long-term memory? Does the file go there with errors? Is that information stored? Is it the appropriate information that goes to the long-term memory? So let them pay attention so that that can happen. Application number 2 of this theory: get information rehearsed. You cannot learn something once. Go through it again and again, explore it differently, ask questions, challenging questions on the same. As you keep going back and forth on this information, you are getting this information rehearsed, and so it will be difficult to forget. All right? How do we apply this model, the information from this model, to a classroom running situation? So the third way to do this: get learned material stored in the long-term memory. Get that material that has been learned. Move from the first box to the last box. So let it move from the sensory memory, push it to the short-term memory, and then push it to the long-term memory. And we've gone through the sensory memory, the short-term memory, and the long-term memory, so you know how to push information through. The fourth way to apply the information processing theory to our learning situation: get information overlearned. Get information overlearned. Overlearning means learning beyond the criterion. The individual keeps on going over and over materials that he or she has already grasped, figured out, understood, gotten the skill, and so on and so forth. Keep getting that information overlearned, overlearning. And I've told you what overlearning is. Lastly but not the least, the fifth way on how to apply the application of the information processing theory is by proper filing. By proper filing. Proper filing in the long-term memory. And you do this to avoid wrong data getting to the long-term memory. And how can you do this? By making sure distractions are kept at bay. Concentration is assured. All right? When you allow inconvenience to come in, then proper filing will not be achieved. So then that is what I wanted us to look at today.